Hello, it's Michelle, and welcome to my May 2014 reading wrap-up. I read 9 novels in May, 1 graphic novel, and 1 novella, and I'd love to tell you all about it. The first novel that I read in May was The Martian by Andy Weir, and this was a science fiction pick from one of my Goodreads groups, and I'm so glad they picked it. It's hard science fiction, which means it contains some math, science, and technology, but those are right up my alley, so I didn't mind at all. But if those aren't your cup of tea, don't worry, those are sprinkled around with lots of intense moments from events occurring in the plotline, and Mark Watney, the main character's sense of humor. He is so sarcastic and so funny. In fact, it was so funny, I learned to use the highlights in my Kindle, which I had not done for the past 2 years, so I highly recommend this book. It was very funny. The first line of the book is one of my favorite first lines from a book ever, but it contains a swear word, so I won't repeat it, but I thought it was just terrific. My cat agrees, if you didn't hear that. So I gave this 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Next up, I read Eleanor Park by Rainbow Rowell. This was my first Rainbow Rowell novel, and I read it with a group from Goodreads. I really enjoyed her writing style. I liked the contrast between Eleanor's family and Park's family, and the dynamic, of course, between those two characters, and I really was motivated to keep reading, and it was interesting and seemed fairly realistic. I loved that part of it. I was, however, a little bit disappointed with how limited the narrator's scope was, and I felt like a few more motivations could have been revealed in the book to make it slightly more enjoyable for me. So I did end up giving it 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Next, I got a digital advanced copy of Half a King by Joe Abercrombie, and this is a fantasy novel. It's the first in a series, but it had plenty of closure and could stand on its own. It follows a young man named Yarvi who is a prince and in line for the throne, but he has a hand that is malformed and was at birth, and so most folks in the kingdom consider him not fit to be a king. Of course, things happen, and all of a sudden he's forced to try to regain the throne that his family has lost, and the story follows him. The amazing thing about this story was the amount of plot twists. At 16%, there was an oh my goodness plot twist, and I hadn't been that surprised by a story since reading Game of Thrones, and it didn't stop there. I really enjoyed this book. The characters were great. The world building was great. The plot twists, as I've already said, were amazing. If I did have one complaint about this book, it would be that there was a character in it named Nothing. And that was highly confusing to read when a sentence started off with the word nothing. It is just not usually a name, and so it was very hard for my brain to adjust to that being the name of a person, and I ended up rereading a lot and getting a little frustrated with that aspect of it. Other than that, I gave it 5 out of 5 on Goodreads, and this was an advanced copy. It does come out on July 15th if you are interested. The next story I picked up was realistic fiction because I felt like I needed some realism after Half a King. It was just so fantastical. So I picked up When I Found You by Katherine Ryan Hyde, and this is not my favorite cover ever, but there are alternative covers if you're thinking about getting a physical copy of the book. But the story was beautiful. It was sparsely written, which was absolutely perfect for this novel. It follows Nathan, who is a man in probably his late 40s, early 50s at the beginning of the story, and he finds a baby in the woods. And the story follows how the two of their lives interact through many decades to come after that. So it was very touching, very enjoyable. It enjoyed themes of parenting and loyalty and how important it is to have someone consistent to rely on in your lifetime. I did give this 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. Next up, I read some more realistic fiction. I read Undeliverable by Rebecca A. Demarest, and this novel follows Ben. And Ben is a father, and his 6-year-old son goes missing. His marriage falls apart, and he is trying to put the pieces of his life back together and continue the search for his missing son. He takes a job at the post office in the department that deals with mail that cannot be delivered. And so he, of course, has tons of baggage, and this makes his relationship with his coworkers very interesting. And of course, as the story goes along, we find out everybody has baggage of one sort or another. It was a highly enjoyable read. I did think it kind of had trouble wrapping itself up, and so I did rate it 4 out of 5, but it was very enjoyable and I recommend it. Next, I picked up the graphic novel Saga by Brian Vaughan with illustrations by Fiona Staples. This has been getting quite a bit of buzz around BookTube, and I wanted something kind of quick and light, and so I picked this up. It wasn't as light as I was thinking it might be, but it was still very enjoyable. I thought the illustrations were fabulous. I thought many of the elements in the world that has been created were fantastic and interesting and unique. I laughed out loud in many parts of this book, found parts of it very hilarious, but I did struggle with the graphic nature and content of the story. I just thought the story could have held its own without some of those elements, but maybe that's just the school teacher in me coming out, I'm not sure. I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5, and I'm not sure if I will continue with the series or not. Next, I read Cinder by Melissa Meyer, and I had avoided this book for quite some time for 2 reasons. One, I am not the biggest fan of fairy tale retellings. I hate that I already know how the story is going to end, and I have trouble motivating myself to finish those kinds of stories. Secondly, it had a lot of hype on BookTube, but so did Shatter Me, and I didn't really enjoy Shatter Me, so I was afraid that this was going to fall into that category, but I shouldn't have been afraid at all. I absolutely adored this book. I love the cyborg elements. I love the android elements. Marissa Meyer can write some awesome characters. How could you not love Prince Kaito, and how could you not hate Queen Lavanna? So I thought for a fairy tale, she did an excellent job of developing those characters. I thought the side characters were all well developed. I thought the world unfolded beautifully. The story just kept getting better and better. When the story ended, I found myself struggling because it wasn't exactly like the fairy tale. And I know, I want to be surprised, but for some reason I had a problem with that. So in the end, I gave it 4 out of 5 because I was feeling a little disappointed in how the story went, but I will continue on with the series and have a feeling I will love those as well. Next up, I picked up a novella, which is something I've never done before and probably wouldn't have considered if it hadn't been for the BookTube community. But I loved the Under the Never Sky trilogy, and especially the character Roar, so when I found out there was a novella that involved Roar and Liv, I thought, why not? I loved the world, and who wouldn't want more Roar in their lives? So I did read Roar and Liv, an Under the Never Sky story. I thought it was a fabulous way to kind of get back into the world, and I love that it explained why Roar was so devoted to both Liv and Perry. And it was beautiful, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up, I read The Storied Life of AJ Fikri by Gabrielle Zevin. I really enjoyed this book. It follows AJ, who is a bookseller on an island that mostly gets its business from tourists that come in, and a little bit from the local townspeople. And AJ is kind of grumpy and depressed. He is widowed and just not finding life enjoyable. And all of a sudden, someone leaves a baby in his bookstore. And their lives intertwine, and the story follows them from there. It was well written. It was very interesting. It was very hard to put down. There were 3 things that I really, really enjoyed about this book. The first was that the characters were very atypical. They had flaws, and they made a lot of mistakes. Secondly, there was a police officer in the story who was just a fabulous person, and I just thought that was great, and just think there needs to be more of that in fiction. I'm not exactly sure why I held on to that so much, but it was very important to me in this book. Thirdly, I love the diversity of the characters, and by that I mean they were different ages, they had different career paths, they were different races. It was just a hodgepodge of personalities, and that was refreshing after reading so much YA to see that diversity in a book. I highly recommend it. I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads. Next, I picked up Transcendence by Shay Savage. This is a new adult romance, and the narrator is Ed, who is a caveman. And into this caveman's world comes a modern-day woman. And the 2 of them trying to communicate, being narrated by Ed, is just very comical at times, quite funny. The love story in this was very well written. The new adult romance, not so much. The timeline shifted, not often, but sometimes without any cues, and so it was a little difficult to follow, so that got a little bit irritating. I really had to force myself to finish the last quarter of this book, But in the end, I'm glad I did, because maybe it shed a little light on the way that men in this world think. So I did enjoy it, but only gave it 3 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Next up, I read The Fire Wish by Amber Lowe, or Amber Lau. Sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. This is a modern-day fairy tale set in Baghdad, which I thought added a unique element to the story. This was an advanced reader's copy that I got digitally from NetGalley, so thank you so much for the approval. The story follows a genie and a princess who end up swapping places. I really thought the world of the genies was wonderfully described. There was just enough world building in it to be satisfying and not so much that it was overwhelming. I really think this author excels at writing first love. There was a scene with the first kiss that involved temperatures in the description that I thought was just fabulous. I read this quickly. I thought about it when I wasn't reading it. It was highly enjoyable. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And that was my reading wrap up for May 2014. What did you read? I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.